Hello and welcome to Bury Our Bones with Cinema, the podcast that lives, breathes and dies both classic movies and the ones that we wish were scrubbed from existence. In today's episode, we venture into uncharted waters by exploring some well below par movie sequels in comparison to the sequels we actually wanted. So sit back with your favourite beverage, a massive bowl full of savoury snacks, and try not to cry too much as we wonder how movie makers can take everything we love about a film and proceed to curl one giant-sized turd over all of our hopes and dreams.
Book your tickets now to see Michael Caine's Tangerine Tambourine. Critics are calling it a show like no other. Playing the hit singles from the number 4 smash album, The Real Slim Caney. Such hits as Not a Lot of People Know That and Hi, My Name Is and Sweet 15. Michael Caine's Tangerine Tambourine. Book now.
Now, it has been a while since we've released an episode. Last time was just before Christmas with Jingle All the Way. If you haven't listened to that already, go back and listen to it because it is a cracking episode, along with all of our other 11 episodes, 12 in total. Do go back and have a listen. I just want to address some couple of elephants in the room. So, as some of you may know, Jim, my recording partner, he had a newborn just before we launched the first season of Bury Our Bones with Cinema. And because of that, obviously, it's becoming increasingly difficult to actually sit down, watch a couple of films, sit down to actually record the podcast. Time is precious when you have a newborn, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to find that time. So we've made a little bit of a conscious decision we don't really want to leave our listeners in the lurch, but also we understand that it's going to be difficult for us to both be in the same room and sit down and record. So what we've effectively tried to do is try and provide you with the same sort of experience that you get when you listen to an episode of Bury Our Bones with, but it's going to be mainly me recording, and we may have some inserts from Jim as and when he gets some time, because we don't want to lose his voice on this podcast, and at the same time we don't want to lose the audience that we have built up, because we do appreciate those avid listeners and those people who tune in every week to listen to our podcast. So that out of the way, as you can probably deduce, we're also going at this a slightly different way as well. So rather than, for the foreseeable future, tackling a single film or going through a film in its entirety like we did previously with an in-depth discussion and things like that, we're going to start looking at doing things in a slightly different way. So we're going to have a mixture of film reviews, we're going to have a mixture of sort of topics and titles that we're going to go through and pick out some examples of films, and we're just going to try and mix it up a little bit until we can actually get back in the same room, look in depth at a single film and go through those things as we really kind of want to, until we get that time back. Obviously myself and Jim are in very, very different positions, so naturally it is going to be difficult. So as you listen to in the little bit of the intro that's become a staple of Bury Our Bones with Cinema, we're going to be looking at today sequels that we wanted versus sequels we actually got. Now, what we mean by that is when a film's released and it's touted to have a sequel, we often really do want a certain thing from that sequel, or we have an expectation of what that sequel needs to be. And unfortunately, more often than not, sequels very, very rarely live up to those expectations. We often find ourselves going, it was good, but not quite as good as the first one, or totally ruined, everything we loved about the first one. So that's what I'm going to be looking at today and going through, and we're going to pick out some examples, and we're going to go through, the facts and figures of those things, and perhaps look at why they didn't quite meet those same expectations and those same heights as the first film. So we're going to start off with some an honourable mention. So the honourable mention I've started with is Beneath the Planet of the Apes, so the sequel to the 1968 classic Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston. It was a bit of a weird one, really, because Charlton Heston was in the sequel, but he was in it very much towards the latter stages, and he clearly didn't want to be signed on for the sequel. He clearly wanted to just, very much get his character out of the way so that he wouldn't be necessarily tied to future sequels. And so because of that, we had, he was essentially, that lead role was recast, and nothing wrong with the chap who played that character, but it just wasn't quite the same thing. Some interesting ideas, but unfortunately, because we knew Charlton Heston's character didn't die, we kind of wanted to see that continuation of what happened, because it was left very open-ended at the end of that first film, that classic twist with, Statue of Liberty, and then finding out that actually the Planet of the Apes is Earth, it's just in the future. We wanted a continuation of that story, and we never kind of got it. We kind of got this kind of half-assed, jumbled, not really one thing or the other film. And so because of that, it becomes a little bit stagnant and a little bit difficult to watch at times, because we were just waiting for that reveal of, is Charlton Heston going to be in this, or what's happened to that character, because the whole film does kind of aren't trying to answer that question, what happened to his character. So again, a bit of an honourable mention there, but I think there are enough good things about that film for it to not necessarily warrant a good chunk of time looking through that.
This message was sponsored by Cactus Energy, coming in our favourite flavours, cactus and cacti. Side effects possible.
So sequels. The impossible puzzle. The poison chalice of movie making, if you like. It's one of those things, if you get it right, you gain all of the heavenly glory, untold riches, and your movie franchise can go on to live forever as a cultural icon. If you get it wrong, if you choose poorly, not only do you end up disintegrating into dust before our very eyes and are banished to the fiery depths of hell that is Channel 5 movie night on a Tuesday, you can potentially destroy a franchise for over a decade. You can just end it. It becomes unbankable. And as you know, for every Last Crusade, there's a Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. For every Dark Knight, there's a Batman v Superman. I mean, as I say that, but it's actually worse than that, because as well as there being a Kingdom for a Crystal Skull, for the Kingdom for the Crystal Skull, as well as there being a Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, there is also a Dial of Destiny. There's also a Justice League, a Batman and Robin, and a Batman Forever. The quality sequel is rare. It's a rare beast to nail down. And let's be honest, the sequel is rarely more, when you strip it down, it's rarely more than the opportunity for the studio to squeeze some extra bucks out of your pocket and into their own. That and the ability for the execs to pat themselves on the back as the geniuses they are for greenlighting the projects in the first place. They're the gatekeepers, the tastemakers, and to them they are the ones who know what the audience want. The truth is they all sit about scared to death of making the wrong decisions and costing the company money and losing their jobs. So if you get a film that's successful enough to warrant a sequel, it's so self-aggrandizing, which is interesting because, as we all know, there's nothing more guaranteed to kill a sequel in its tracks, like studio interference. Rarely will they simply hire a writer and a director and trust them to manifest their vision into reality. The constant rewrites, directorial demands, and even personnel changes from up high are almost guaranteed to sink a potential classic to the realms of, straight to streaming. And it's all in the name of fan service, and let alone if your star of your movie also starts having opinions of delusions of grandeur, as it were, and opinions of how the film should go. Like, it's a tricky line to walk, and like fan service itself has always been like walking a tightrope. We want more of the same, but we want it different. Don't pander to me, but don't deviate too far either. We want the character growth, but we don't want you to change them too much. We want you to know exactly what the movie is I want to see, even though I don't know what I want to see yet. It's impossible, especially in the age of the internet. Like, you can't please everybody, and you are going to hear about it no matter what. You're going to upset a huge percentage of your audience especially in this day and age. The studio's mantra, the studio's fix for this seems to be bigger is better, more of the same but on steroids. And this rarely yields very interesting results at all.
Brought to you by Cactus Energy, the only energy drink to keep you up all night long. Side effects possible.
So my first example of a sequel that we wanted versus a sequel that we got is Mission Impossible 2. Now, the first Mission Impossible, obviously Brian De Palma's directing, was a fantastic introduction and essentially a reimagining of that old 50s and 60s TV show that was a little bit camp, a little bit, Sunday afternoon telly. Wasn't necessarily ever going to be too gritty or too real or, tackle things that really made you think. It was just a little bit of light-hearted afternoon telly. But what Brian De Palma done in that first Mission Impossible film is he raised those stakes but kept them incredibly realistic. And he made you immediately think and question about the world of espionage. Ethan Hunt's team in, the first act is essentially totally wiped out. And it's almost Ethan Hunt is that lone person fighting against who do I trust, who do I not trust. And there's elements of film noir in that opening act. There's some iconic set pieces, with the chewing gum stuck together. One side is green, one side is pink. Stick it together, it blows up, and it goes against that fish tank, and it explodes, and all of that water. And you've got that iconic scene of Tom Cruise jumping out of the restaurant and running away, from that restaurant. It is a really, really good opening act that sets up, the middle and the end of the film in a really strong way. And unfortunately, Mission Impossible 2 detracted away from that in a very, very difficult. Not difficult, but in a very different way. It felt almost as though it was a script that was written for another franchise or for a standalone film, and they just put Tom Cruise and slaps the Mission Impossible 2 brand on it. And because of that, I would say it's probably the only Mission Impossible in the franchise that isn't a good film. There's certainly stuff to enjoy about it, but on the whole, it's not a good film. And budget-wise, it naturally had a bigger budget off of the success of Mission Impossible. So Mission Impossible 1 was released in May 22nd, 1996, had an $80 million budget. It made $45 million thereabouts on its opening weekend, and had a domestic gross of $180.9 million and a world gross of $457 million. So a very, very successful film. So you can see immediately why they wanted a sequel out of it, because it made good money. You know, it made over half of its budgets back in its opening weekend, and its domestic gross, it far exceeded what you would consider the expectations for that film. Mission Impossible 2 had a budget of 125 million, so again, another 45 million on top of the original 80. Very much a bigger budget affair, naturally. You know, opening weekend, 57 million, so successful in its opening weekend. Domestic gross, 215 million, so you've almost doubled your initial budget there in your domestic gross. And worldwide gross, you've got 860.9 million, so it's not, in terms of budget and money, it is not an unsuccessful film. If anything, it's more successful than the original. I just think that's probably more with the expectation of it's the sequel to Mission Impossible, rather than people have gone to see it, you need to go and see Mission Impossible 2. It's fantastic. I don't think that's what happened here. I think it was more a case of the Mission Impossible name is what carried people to the cinema. If we compare the film crews, so the original, as I mentioned previously, Brian De Palma directed. It was written by David Coep, Steven Zalian and Robert Towne, who wrote the screenplay respectively. Produced by Tom Cruise. I think this may have been one of the first few films that Tom Cruise started his producing credits. He produced that alongside Paula Wagner. Composer was Danny Elfman. Cinematographer Stephen H. Burham. If we compare that to Mission Impossible 2, it was directed by John Woo, which goes somewhat to explaining why those action sequences look so different. John Woo has a very, very signature style. If anybody's seen any of his earlier films with Chow Yun-fat, like Hard Boiled, it's very much similar to The Matrix in its style of action sequences and fight sequences. You've got Ronald D. Moore, Brannon Braga and Robert Towne again on the screenplay and story. Again, it was produced by Tom Cruise and Paula Wagner. So you have got some continuity there from one film to the next. So Hans Zimmer came on to compose some of the music here, and I was quite surprised by this because it didn't feel like a Hans Zimmer score or a Hans Zimmer score that we'd come to know in recent years. I think it was at that time where he was doing quite a lot of different stuff. He would do things like Lion King. He would then go on to do things like Mission Impossible 2 or Pearl Harbor, or, you know, a lot of the music he was doing was very, very different. Whereas now I think Hans Zimmer tends to go for those big blockbuster films. It's very similar in their style. You can almost usually pick out, that's a Hans Zimmer score there. Not in a bad way. He just, again, has that signature style. And the cinematographer was Jeffrey L. Kimball. So there's some continuity between the production of the first film and the second film, but there are some differences as well, and I think that really comes across when you watch the film. If we compare, not that I take too much merit in these things, but things like IMDb scores and Rotten Tomatoes scores. So the first film has a 7.2 rating. The second film has a 6.1 rating. So you're dropping a whole mark there, essentially, and a bit more. In Rotten Tomatoes scores, this is the audience score, 71% audience score for the first film, and a 42% score for the second film. So there is a big difference there in what audiences thought of the first and the second film. As I say, they do feel very much like very, very different films, other than the fact they're called Mission Impossible and they have some of the same characters. Which, whilst we're on that, let's go through the cast. So Tom Cruise plays Ethan Hunt, as we all know. John Voight plays Jim Phelps. Emmanuel Burt plays Claire. Henry Czerny plays Kittredge. Jean Reno plays Krieger, Ving Rhames plays Luther, Christian Scott Thomas plays Sarah Davis, and Vanessa Redgrave plays Max in the first film. We also have a cameo, I'm calling it a cameo because he dies very, very early on, but from Emilio Estevez, which I think was, again, a good thing about that first film is you've got a star in Emilio Estevez who has a little bit of cachet, and in that first act, he's killed. Same with Christian Scott Thomas. You've got a bit of cachet there. You've got a name, and they're killed off. If we move over to Mission Impossible 2, we have Tom Cruise returning as Ethan Hunt. We have Dougray Scott playing Sean Ambrose, Sandy Newton playing Nia Hall, Ving Rhames playing Luther, Richard Roxburgh playing Hugh Stamp, Brendan Gleeson playing McCloy, and Raid Sabergia playing Dr. Nerovich. So, some good names there, some returning names in Ving Rhames and Tom Cruise. I think one of the problems with Mission Impossible 2 is that its villain is a little bit lackluster. It reminds me a lot of these Marvel movies at the moment that aren't part of, the main Avengers films, when they go off and do their solo pictures. They almost are, it's a villain of the movie. It doesn't really go beyond anything else other than doing what they do in that particular movie. A little bit like when we watch TV programs with 25 episodes a season. I'm thinking Supernatural, where it had a monster of the week type feel. So they don't really go beyond the parameters of this. And I think with Dougray Scott, his acting in this is a little bit over the top. It's a little bit ham-fisted, and he doesn't have that same gravitas that essentially Jon Voight does in the first film. But I think the main thing that really kind of sets Mission Impossible 2 as being the lesser film, that kind of sums up everything about the film, is the opening rock climbing scene. So it's a totally pointless scene, totally pointless to the story. It doesn't add anything whatsoever to the narrative. It doesn't do anything other than show you that, this looks cool. Oh, look, it's Tom Cruise, who, to be fair, was doing a lot of the rock climbing himself, obviously with safety parameters involved, but that's all it's there for. And that's, what I feel like is the biggest problem with Mission Impossible 2, is it's all there to look cool. There doesn't seem to be a lot of substance. It's a product of its time, coming out in 2000. A lot of the films were there just to be brash, loud, in your face, and didn't really have a lot of substance. Not all films, but it was a product of its time. Compared to the opening sequence of Mission Impossible 1, where they do the Kiev scene, where you see the initial face mask being pulled off, and it subverts the expectations, sets the stakes of the film quite high. Following on from when his team gets killed in that mission, and it's just Ethan Hunt on his own. It's very much a total contrast with that rock climbing scene. It just seems to have no emphasis and no overall bearing on that story. And I think that's part of the problem, is the story itself isn't particularly interesting and doesn't ever really pull you in and get you invested in that narrative. It's essentially, we wanted to see a continuation of that film noir-esque, feel to it. Brian De Palma done that brilliantly in that first film. He made that opening sequence, which I keep going back to. The opening, he made that have a feel about it. You're watching that, and there was an undercurrent of something's going to go wrong here. Something isn't quite right, It was very clever the way it was done. That's partly down to the script. I think they also done away with a lot of the things that made the first thing interesting. So the set pieces were thought out and actually had some good cinematography in them. When he rappels down from the ceiling in that room, and the tension of the sweat dropping, and if it falls on the floor, the alarms go off. The tension of that is it is superb, and unfortunately, in that second film, there isn't anything quite like that. There isn't anything where it's like there's a lot of tension here. It all feels throwaway. All feels as though nothing really means anything, and partially down to the script, I would say, partially down to the direction, which focused more on things looking cool. The motorbike sequence towards the end of the film again looks cool, but not really the thing that's going to pull you back in, not the thing that's going to make you want to go and watch that film again, really. You may watch that scene, but you're not necessarily going to go, you know what, I'm going to stick Mission Impossible 2 on. You're more likely to stick the first film on, or the third film, or the fourth, or the fifth. It's one of those franchises. Apart from if number 2 was better than the first one, it would be the only franchise I would say where with each instalment it gets better and better and better. Unfortunately, because of number 2, it starts well, has a little drop off, and then starts to get better and better and better. Mission Impossible 3 is a fantastic movie. Mission Impossible 2 ruins that initial trilogy. It's very, very difficult to go and think, if it had been number 2 had been good, then you could have told a much better story across those first 3 films, rather than having number 2 that feels very much removed from the rest of the franchise and from the rest of the overall narrative. It doesn't really seem to have much overall bearing on the rest of the franchise. It's just very much on its own, not really doing much at all. So if we now start looking at, some things as to how the film was made, and it may kind of start to answer some of the reasonings why it doesn't quite live up to the expectations. So apparently, according to Robert Town, much of his script was written around action scenes that John Woo told him he wanted to be able to direct in the movie. So kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, where we're looking at things and going, well, narratively, it doesn't really do much for us. It's just a collection of action scenes, and that kind of sums it up there. I can understand wanting to have set action scenes and set things happening, but it's almost, you need to start with the narrative first and then go, can we look at that and do that in a cool way, or can we do this in an interesting way, rather than I have these set scenes, I have these set action sequences in mind, write something around that. I think it's always going to feel a little bit forced in that regard. So Andrew Lesnie was the original cinematographer, and he left less than a month into shooting due to the stylistic differences that he had with director John Woo. So again, it sounds like it's not a particularly, smooth running when it comes to directing the film. It sounds very much like there was difficulty in some form of crossed words at the very least had with certain things, The famous rock climbing scene was filmed at Dead Horse Point in Utah, and Tom Cruise was on cables which were then digitally removed. Ron Cork, the climbing double of the overhang stunt, was performed by his main stunt double, Keith Campbell. Director John Woo was so scared each time, but Tom insisted on doing it. And that kind of fits very much with what we know of Tom Cruise. He kind of pushes his body, his danger and his risk to the limits in order to get the sequences that he wants to do. We have that famous scene, and I think it's Ghost Protocol, where he's literally hanging off the side of the plane. That was done legitimately. We have that big sequence in the newest film, Dead Reckoning Part 1, where he is riding a motorcycle off of a cliff, and they actually had to build a massive ramp on the edge of this cliff just to get that shot. And it just sums up Tom Cruise as a filmmaker in general, where he's willing to push his body to the limits in order to achieve, his own art form. And I think you have to commend him for that. But I think there has to come a point where that has to be the secondary, I think, in most cases. I think with action films, yes, those points are important, but when I think about the best action films, they've always got a very good narrative, a narrative that pulls you in, that asks you questions, that doesn't just have throwaway things, and doesn't treat the narrative as being secondary and not necessarily worthy of your time. So director John Woo's first cut of the movie clocked in at around 3.5 hours, which for a Mission Impossible film isn't too far off where they're at now, but at that time, when it's just the sequel to the first film, hasn't built up that prestige in the same way, and it's even longer at 3.5 hours, it's going to be very, very difficult to engage an audience for that long, especially with what the things that I've been talking about, where you go, action sequences come first, narrative isn't really the thing that people are looking for, people are getting out of the story, I should say. Action sequences are essentially the meat on the bone, which I always find, it's cool for that scene, it's cool for a clip that you play on a trailer, but it's not the thing that people keep coming back for, in my opinion. It's certainly not why I go to see a film. I may see a film and go, that was a cool action sequence, but I am more interested in all the other things and why that action sequence is happening, what has led to that event, what has made that special, and why is that relevant to the story. And I think John Woo was concerned apparently with competing with Brian De Palma's style, but Tom Cruise was very adamant that he wanted Woo's style for the movie, and he loved Woo's style. So Cruise's goal was to have each movie be essentially an episode in a different style from a different director, and apparently that's what convinced John Woo to initially come on board. I think all of those things are kind of relevant as to why this film didn't quite meet the expectations, because essentially people weren't to know that going in. I think a lot of people probably wouldn't necessarily know that now, but I know there's been TV shows like American Horror Story, which are each season is a different story, a different narrative, and then it may cross over slightly, but generally speaking, it's more of an anthology series. And I think at that time, I don't think audiences were quite ready for that. I think if people were going to go and see Mission Impossible 2, they wanted something similar to Mission Impossible 1. Maybe not exactly the same, maybe with the stakes turned up just a little bit more, maybe, a continuation of that story, but they certainly didn't want a completely different experience, because otherwise you could just name it anything and put Tom Cruise on it and it's going to sell anyway. I think part of the problem is it never really knew what it was. It never really had a clear identity, and part of that meant that it didn't live up to those expectations. It certainly didn't live up to my expectations. I think if I'm going to go just sit down and watch a Mission Impossible film, the one I'm probably going to skip is going to be number 2. There's some good action sequences in there, as I've mentioned, but it never really lived up to my expectations. And that kind of sums up why I think, this is a bit of a missed opportunity. It's not really the thing that we want. It's not really the sequel that we wanted. We got something completely different.
Quint's Bait and Tackle Shop for all your fishing needs. Next time you're in Martha's Vineyard, check out Quint's Bait and Tackle Shop. We stock a wide range of fishing gear, including rods and reels and bait, and also dynamite. Next time you're in Martha's Vineyards, don't forget to check out Quint's Bait and Tackle Shop. Also, booking now for Quint's offshore fishing. That's Quint's Bait and Tackle Shop, south of the pier, Martha's Vineyard.
I'm going to pick A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. I think this is one of the biggest missed opportunities in horror, really. I think Nightmare on Elm Street 1 built up such a good basis for a franchise, and I think Nightmare on Elm Street 2 really did set, unfortunately, the franchise on a very, very bad path post that first film. I think it's very, very, very much a love it or hate it type film. I know some people who do love it, but it is simply just not at the same degree and the same level as that first film. That first film, fantastic dream horror that genuinely makes you feel unsafe at times, makes you question what is real, what is a dream, and makes you really fear for the characters in that film. And it is a good main character in Heather Langenkamp. Never say her name properly. A really good main character in Heather Langenkamp, as Nancy Thompson. She's very much, in that final girl trope in a good way. We do feel for her. She feels very much alone, other than the support of her boyfriend, played by Johnny Depp. But even then, at times, he's almost a bit like, come on, you're a bit crazy. So we do kind of really sympathize with her character, because she seems to be the only one, other than those who have experienced it as well. She's the only one who's kind of saying, this is a dream, this dream is real. This guy is coming out. He's trying to hurt us and things like that. Freddy was scary in this first film. He hadn't got to the point of the latter, series and latter points in the film where he'd become very much a bit of a caricature. He was funny in places, yes, but he was scary more than anything. And I think a lot of that came down to, for that first, 40 to 45 minutes, you never really, you saw him, yes, and you saw glimpses of him, but it was, that old adage, less is more. We weren't seeing too much to get to a point where it's like, well, it's not scary anymore because I've seen it 4 or 5 times already. At this point, it was very much scary more than he was witty and funny. He had that, yes, and we could see that was there, but it was scary more than anything. And he had an interesting backstory that was slowly dripped out and not force-fed. For the first, I'd say 3/4 of the, maybe half of the film to 3/4 of the film, we're going, okay, so how has this character come to be? What events have led to this? And slowly it's then dripped out by, Nancy Thompson's mum, who, the acting by her isn't particularly great, I'll admit, but we can deal with it because what she's saying and her role in the story is quite interesting, and unfortunately, the second film, I feel very much undone a lot of the work that had been done in that first film. Looking at the budget and the box office, again, similar kind of things as to what I was mentioning previously with Mission Impossible 2. So the first film had a $1.8 million budget when it was released in 1984 on November the 16th. It made 1.2 million back in its opening weekend, so almost all of its entire budget back in its opening weekend, and then the gross was 25,624,000. So it from a $1.8 million budget, very, very good. That's more, probably about 12 and a half times its original budget it's made back in its gross. Nightmare on Elm Street 2, when it was released in almost a year to the day later in 1985, it had a $3 million budget, so an extra 1.2 on top of the original 1.8, and it made 2.8 million back in its, opening weekend. Domestic gross 29.9 million. So, when you can compare those opening weekends, they tell a very similar story. People wanted to come and see this, in its droves for the time, really, in 1985. And I think the fact that it didn't go on to gross more or substantially more, only 4 million more. I know, only 4 million. We have this conversation almost every episode, but the fact that it didn't, get into the 30s or 40 millions for a sequel to a very promising franchise and intellectual property kind of tells you a lot about the word of mouth of the film, And looking at the film crew, we can kind of see potentially why this may have started to fall apart. So the first film was directed by the legendary Wes Craven, and it was also written by him as well. It was produced by Robert Shea. The music was composed by Charles Bernstein. Again, a great score here. The cinematographer was Jacques Haitkin. Saying that a few times when you're drunk, but good cinematography in there as well. If we look at the second film, directed by Jack Shoulder, written by David Shaskin, produced again by Robert Shea, composed by Christopher Young. I think he kind of used a lot of the same stuff and just developed it a little bit more with the music. As a cinematographer, again, was Jacques Haitkin and Christopher Tufty. If we look at those IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes scores again, 7.4 for the original to 5.4 IMDb score for the sequel. So again, a big drop in quality based on those IMDb scores, and the Rotten Tomatoes tell a similar story. 84% score for the original and a 33% audience score for the sequel. So audiences were very much unhappy with the quality of the second film in comparison to the first film. I think, it may be getting into that cult status, but I think on the whole, people were very, very disappointed, and I think people still are disappointed. Looking at the cast, we have Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger in his, legendary performance there. Heather Langenkamp as Nancy Thompson. Amanda Viss as Tina Gray. Zeus Garcia as Rod Lane. Johnny Depp as Glenn Lance. John Saxton as Lieutenant Johnson. And Ronnie Blakely as Marge Thompson. So there's some recognisable names in there, particularly Johnny Depp, obviously, but more for his work post Nightmare on Elm Street. But again, good launching pad for him. Obviously, Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger has become synonymous with the franchise, naturally. And he reprises his role in the second film, Freddy's Revenge, again, playing Freddy. Mark Patton as Jesse Walsh, the main protagonist of this particular film. Kim Myers as Lisa Webb. Robert Russell as Ron Grady. Clu Galuga as Mr. Walsh. And Hope Lange as Mrs. Walsh. So there's differences naturally in, and I think you'll find that in most horror film sequels, apart from perhaps one or two characters, there is going to be a vastly different, because the nature of horror films is that a lot of people get killed off, a lot of people die in horror films, so you're not necessarily always going to be able to have them return in sequels on a regular basis, or become long-standing characters other than perhaps your villain and your main character. So I think one of the scenes that really kind of sums up what's wrong with the sequel is the scene with the bird attacks, which is at about 28 minutes into the movie. And the reason I've picked this scene out is because I think it is just a brilliant example of how misjudged this kind of whole film was. So, the story is very much more of a possession story. So Jesse is possessed by Freddy Krueger through his dreams and kind of starts performing these weird, dangerous acts, and things start happening to him. But it's very much a possession story more than anything else. I think in the first story, it's very clear cut in the sense of this person invades your dreams and wants to harm you in those dreams, and you never really know what's real and what isn't. Whereas I think the second film, it feels very much like it, and to its credit, it could have been trying and do something different from the first film to set itself apart. But I think in doing that, you've kind of lost what it is that everybody loved about the first film. It becomes something entirely different. And this bird scene is kind of an example of that, because it feels like a bad soap opera. I couldn't tell if it was meant to be funny, because it's almost impossible not to laugh when the bird attacks the dad, because it's so over the top and so just so corny that you can't help but laugh. So you must be thinking, well, is this supposed to be comical? But it's played straight, and because of that, it's not quite clear if it is meant to be funny or not. And I think that's part of the problem. Is, again, a bit like Mission Impossible 2, doesn't really know what it is. It has some weird kind of slapstick sitcom vibes, which brings me to the point of the film that can't seem to work out what it wants to be. The acting, yes, the first film doesn't, exactly have Oscar-worthy acting, but for the most part, you can get past the elements that are bad acting. But in the second thing, it's laughable. There's a line, "Oh my God, it's as hot as an oven in here," but the way it's delivered is so staggered and so robotic. It's almost like they've recorded it in post and just put it in there. It's very, very, very strange. Another scene that kind of sums up is that weird sex scene that takes a weird turn. Again, 50 time stamping it, 53 minutes 20 seconds. It just feels very, very strange. Like at some points it's trying too hard, and in some elements it's not trying hard enough. And I think part of the problem when you watch a film is that if it feels like it's trying to do something too much, you automatically switch off. And in contrast to that, if it's not trying hard enough, it's impossible to look away, because you're going, well, this has to be, if this is the final take, what were the other takes like? What were those? What was left on the cutting room floor? Because this doesn't seem like a final take. It doesn't seem like the best of the bad bunch. But obviously, somebody's made the decision, the director or the editor has made that decision that this is the thing. What we really wanted from A Nightmare on Elm Street is we wanted essentially more of the same, but with more elaborate, kind of intricate and creative ways of seeing the characters die. That's kind of essentially what ends up happening in those latter sequels. The death scenes become the thing that everybody's wanting to see. And I think the biggest thing, or the biggest problem with Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, is it just does not know what it wants to be. Doesn't know if it wants to be the same as the first film or if it wants to be something different. And it's kind of neither. It's kind of nothing. It's in between. It's not really doing something so totally different that you go, oh, well, it can stand on its own merit. It's not doing something so different that it can stand totally on its own merit, but it's also not doing anything that you go, that links quite closely to that first film, other than the fact that this person comes and, takes you, tries to harm you in your dreams. So again, some facts about the film. Special effects man Rick Lazzarini created that demon parakeet that we saw, and he created this puppet for it in the scene where the Walsh's bird flies around the room and explodes, which, again, if you haven't seen that, go and see it, because if you don't like horror films, this will probably convince you never to watch one again, because it's so terrible, it's so bad. It's not scary in the slightest. All it is very much comedy 101, really. So his puppet wasn't used, apparently, because the filmmakers wanted a regular looking bird, and I couldn't tell you if that's a good or a bad thing. I think if it had looked demonic, I don't know if that would have made it worse or if that had made it better. It's so difficult to tell, because that scene is such a bad scene that it's almost like, well, could anything help it? New Line Cinema originally didn't ask Robert Englund to return as Freddy, which tells you everything you need to know about the production of this film. If New Line Cinema wasn't going to ask him to reprise his role, okay, at that point he wasn't necessarily the character and the cult figure he is now. But why would you not have that titular character, or not titular character, but why would you not have that main villain from the first film? Why would you not have him return? What, or at least why would you not have that same actor playing that character? They refused to give him a pay rise, and so a stuntman was cast as Freddy at the start of production. And after about 2 weeks of filming, Robert Shea realised that was a bad move. We should get Robert Englund back, and so they fired the stuntman and hired Englund and met his demands. And it's almost that thing of going, you could have saved yourself 2 weeks of production time. You could have saved yourself sour words and souring a relationship with your lead actor. Essentially, it's just again another example of movie executives not necessarily always having the movie's best interest at heart and more thinking about their pockets and their purse strings, which we kind of know happens, but ultimately it's only going to benefit them if the movie's better. And sometimes they can't see the money for the movie, for lack of a better term. The only Nightmare film in which the lead character is male. Now, I always think that the best horror films are ones where there's a female character as the lead. I don't know why that is, but they just tend to work better. I think obviously it's become that final girl trope, but I think there's a reason why it became a trope, because it works. Obviously there's different ways of doing it. You can have it, almost Scream Queen-esque in the style of Halloween. You can have it, them be a strong female character in other aspects, a little bit like Ripley from Alien. I just find, female leads in horror films work better in the context of horror films. But that's just me personally. I'm not saying that this was the reason that this film didn't work, but for me, it's a reason why I find it a little bit more difficult to get on board. That's just my personal opinion. Interestingly, Michael J. Fox was apparently considered for the role of Jesse Welsh, but was unable due to commitments to Back to the Future and Teen Wolf. Now, I think if you put Michael J. Fox in A Nightmare on Elm Street, whilst I'd be very interested to see how that goes, I don't think that works. I think Michael J. Fox is far too charismatic and far too light-hearted, especially at that time, in his performances, that it would have made it detract even more. And I think it would have gone down that comedy route more definitively. I think here, as I say, it doesn't really know if it's a comedy or if it's a horror, but I think they would have had to have made that decision, because Michael J. Fox is so charismatic and so naturally funny in his performances that you can't really get away from it. I don't think I've seen a Michael J. Fox film where he's been really dramatic, and that, to be fair, I haven't seen a lot of Michael J. Fox's work other than Back to the Future and Teen Wolf, but I've not seen a really dramatic performance from Michael J. Fox where there isn't elements of humour within that. So I think they not necessarily dodged a bullet, but I think if they had have gone with that, they'd have had to have taken the franchise into a very, very different direction. Apparently the producer, Robert Shea, wanted the character of Mr. Grady, wanted to play the character of Mr. Grady, but was convinced not to by the director. And again, I think that's a very, very shrewd move. I would query why a producer wants to insert himself as a cast member into a movie. I don't know his background, if he's done acting work in the past, but if you're there on the role of a producer in a second film, and you want to introduce yourself as a character into the film or play a character in the film, I think that kind of sums up potentially your agenda, for lack of a better term. I think that kind of points to problems in production and perhaps some, soured relationships between, Wes Craven Jack Shoulder and, Robert Englund and, all of those intricate relationships that you kind of need to keep positive for a long-running franchise. And interestingly, Heather Langenkamp was never asked to come back, and the producers never thought of adding her to the story. Again, big missed opportunity. In the third one, she returns, and it's like, now we're starting to follow on from that story that I set up in the first film. I think there's mentions of her character Nancy Thompson in the second film, but again, it's throwaway. It's never really used as like the main crux of the story, and it's left fairly open-ended at the end of the film. Yes, okay, we see her drive off in the car with her friends, and we see that it's actually, the roof comes up and it's in the same pattern as Freddy's jumper, but we don't specifically know what happens. And I think we kind of wanted to know what happens. I know when I first watched Nightmare on Elm Street, I wanted to watch the second one and go, I wonder where the continuation of that story is. I wonder what's happened, what's going on, and never really got that. And I think that was a bit of a missed opportunity. And I think the third film almost forced their hand, and they had to bring Heather Langenkamp back because it's what audiences wanted. I think if you'd have done it in the second film, you could have opened up that third film a lot more, but unfortunately the second film kind of forced it to narrow it down a particular route. Robert Englund has stated that Freddy's Revenge is his least favourite, and it's not really surprising. I think perhaps that's maybe because he wasn't initially asked to come back because of his demands for a pay rise, because that may have soured that relationship. I also think, it's the most lackluster film in the franchise. Like, Freddy doesn't really do much. It's through Jesse, and we don't really want to see Jesse doing all this stuff because we don't really know Jesse. We want to see Freddy do it. Yes, okay, there's that scene where he, kills a load of kids at the pool, but that felt almost a little bit too much. It was like, okay, well, we want to see individuals kind of and how they deal with it, but this was like a group of them, and it just felt too much, I think, in that. And I think it was a very lackluster Freddy narrative, really. And I think the biggest problem is because Wes Craven wasn't directing. Okay, he didn't write it, the story, but I think at the very least, if he'd have directed it, it would have been somewhat closer to what we wanted in a sequel to the first film. He states he didn't like it. He stated the film scripts were substandard, which is why he didn't come on to direct it. Apparently it took too many liberties for him with the Freddy Krueger character. I would agree with that. And broke many of the rules set up in the original. And I think ultimately that's part of the point. If you set up rules in the original, okay, they may not be incredibly, they may not be immediately obvious and set out, but you can pick them out. If you're going to go and break those in the second film and not really do it in a way where we've been clamouring for those rules to be broken, it hadn't got to that point. By the time it gets to A New Nightmare, where it's almost, it's a story within a story, by that point, yes, we do want those rules to be broken because we've seen numerous entries where those rules have been upheld. So by that point, yes, we want to see those rules broken, but not in the second film. And I think that kind of just sums up everything that's wrong with Freddy's Revenge. It didn't know if it wanted to be a comedy or a horror. It didn't follow the rules set out by the first film. It took liberties with the Freddy Krueger character. And ultimately, it's just not very interesting. It's just a very below par, substandard, a little bit boring horror film, which horror films should never be boring. That's when you should be able to do the things that perhaps you couldn't do in, say, a drama or a comedy or a thriller. In a horror, you can really push that creative envelope. And unfortunately, we didn't see that in this film, and that is vast majority of the problem with Freddy's Revenge here. And I think that moves us on quite nicely to kind of the closing thoughts of this particular argument of sequels we got versus sequels that we actually wanted. So why is it so hard to get a sequel right? Well, partially it's because of audience expectations. You know, we spoke about this numerous times in our previous season. When you go into a film with a certain expectation of what you want, it's very, very difficult for a film to actually live up to that. And that's not the fault of the filmmakers. That's not the fault of the directors, the actors, the writers, or anybody who works on it. It's almost sometimes an audience problem. You know, I think sometimes we need to curb our expectations and go, well, it's not going to be exactly the same as the first one. It's not going to be exactly what I want, but I'm open-minded to it being something that I enjoy. I think that's, you know, vast majority of people who watch films will probably have that attitude. I think there are, you know, a very subset group of avid movie fans who want a very specific thing from a film. If they don't get that, they're not happy. And I understand that, but at some point we have to make a compromise there. I think another reason why sequels are always quite difficult to get right is because usually the reason they're there is because it's a money-making scheme. You know, if we look at Mission Impossible 1 to Mission Impossible 2, and the same with Nightmare on Elm Street and the Nightmare on Elm Street 2, those decisions to have a sequel weren't because there's more to this story that we haven't seen yet. There's more that the audience need to see, more that, you know, narratively that we can do. Whilst there is that, that's not necessarily always at the forefront of the decision making. Usually it's because let's see if we can get some more money out of this franchise. Let's see if we can get some more money out of this narrative. And because you're coming at it usually, or at least the executives are usually coming at it from that angle, it's usually a case of let's do anything we can to get it. So in the instance of Freddy's Revenge, we have a returning Robert Englund. He wants a little bit more of a pay rise because it looks like he's going to be, you know, a returning character. He wants a little bit more compensation for that. No, we don't want to do that. Let's recast him. That, to me, says that you don't really understand why we liked the first one, because a lot of it was because of Robert Englund's performance. I think another reason is because sometimes it's that difficult fine line of departing from the original work in order to set it out, but losing what made the first one popular and what made people want to see a sequel in the first place. I'm all for changing things and doing things differently, but ultimately there needs to be a through line or a thread that keeps people going, yes, it's different, but this is good for the first thing. This is that thing that actually is really, really helpful for me to watch as a movie viewer. I need to have this. I need to have that, and that's when you can change those elements. You know, I'm thinking Terminator 1 to Terminator 2. Yes, Terminator 1 was successful, but it became even bigger partially because they made Arnold Schwarzenegger a good guy. I've said my thoughts on those ones, but that was a true move to differentiate it from that first film. So it wasn't just, you know, essentially 1.1. It was actually a separate film that stands up on its own merit. And in some cases, you have to ask the question, does a sequel have to be the same at all? In some cases, yes. It has to be not necessarily exactly the same, but it has to follow the same tropes, the same rules, and the same things that have been set up in the first one. And it has to almost create bigger stakes, create something that we haven't seen before. So it's a very, very difficult thing to get a sequel right. There's not many sequels that are better than the original. There may be some, and in which case maybe hinting at, the next episode there at sequels that are better than the original, but they're few and far between. Usually sequels, I'm not saying all sequels are bad, but usually sequels aren't quite as good as the first film. Temple of Doom, still a good film, but it's not quite as good as Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's always a really, really tricky thing for lack of a better term, quit whilst you're ahead sometimes. Not every movie needs a sequel. And I think sometimes having a standalone film is better than having a trilogy of two, one good film and two below par films, because it just sours the taste on that franchise.
Now, you could be forgiven for thinking you're listening to a Spaniard ordering a beer on the Costa del Sol. You could almost feel the sun beating down on his bullfighting cape. But what you were actually listening to was me, Sean Connery, displaying just one of the many accents that you too can master at the Sean Connery Dialect School for Actors. Now let me transport you to a Cold War era Russian submarine with flawless Russian dialect. This is my boat now, Captain Phillips. That was magic. You can learn this and many more at the Sean Connery Dialect School for Actors. Here endeth the lesson.
So that brings us on to the end of the episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe and follow from wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Ryan Etherington, he's been Jimmy Murphy, and we have been Bury Our Bones with Cinema. And it will be a one-button job. Boom, 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 boom.
I have a terrible tendency to just scroll about and you're talking when we're doing it. I still find it slightly distracting.
It's a bit weird, but I think it's a bit weird. But I suppose
maybe if you listen to it back, see if it sounds. I was like, I'm gonna have to stop it.